a drafting room in Nagoya, central Japan, on a winter night in 1938, a single desk lamp, a red pencil, a man of 34 years old, small, quiet, staring at a blueprint the way a surgeon stares at an X-ray before he decides where to cut. There are two ledgers in every engineer's life. The first ledger is what you build. Mine is called the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. In the 18 months after it entered service, it destroyed roughly 12 Allied aircraft for every one of its own. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, Ceylon. Nothing on earth could catch it in a turning fight. The second ledger is what you traded for it. I traded the steel plate behind the pilot's head. I traded the rubber lining that would have stopped his fuel tank from becoming a bomb. I traded protection for performance because Japanese engines were 20% weaker than American engines, and there was no other way to close the gap. 10,939 of these airplanes were built. I know how most of them ended. I know how most of the boys inside them ended. And I knew, on this night in 1938, before the first prototype ever left the ground, exactly what I was signing. Before I tell you what I destroyed, let me tell you what built me. Nagoya, Central Honshu, the largest aircraft factory in the Japanese Empire, its chimneys cutting a straight line across the winter sky above a river that has not stopped moving in 1,000 years. 70 years earlier, a man named Yataro Iwasaki stood on the docks of Tosa province with nothing but a former samurai's rage and a shipping contract from the new Meiji government. That contract became a fleet. The fleet became a bank. The bank became a coal mine, a steel mill, a shipyard, a paper mill, an insurance company. By 1934, the name he chose, three diamonds arranged around a single point, controlled the largest private industrial empire in Japan. Mitsubishi built the ships that carried our soldiers to Manchuria. It built the rifles those soldiers carried. It built the trains that moved them. And in a walled compound in Nagoya, it built the airplanes that would carry a war across the Pacific Ocean. But there was one thing Mitsubishi could not build, an engine that could match an American engine. Every horsepower we produced, they produced 20% more. Every rotation of our propellers, theirs turned harder. This was not a secret. It was the arithmetic of every aircraft designer in Tokyo. We had the metallurgists, we had the machinists. We did not have the alloys. We did not have the fuels, and we did not have the 40 industrial years America had spent building Pratt and Whitney and Wright. An empire cannot afford to be second in the sky, and so an empire sent its most difficult problem to a man who did not look like he could solve it. My name is Jiro Horikoshi. I was born on the 22nd of June, 1903, in a farmhouse near the city of Fujioka, in Gunma Prefecture, north of Tokyo. I was a small child. I was often sick. I watched the sky more than I watched other children. When I was 7, a military balloon drifted over my village on a summer morning. I did not sleep for 3 nights. I told my mother I would learn to build what I had seen. She did not understand. She did not stop me. In 1927, I graduated from the Aviation Laboratory of Tokyo Imperial University. One of the first cohorts of engineers Japan ever trained specifically to design airplanes. My country had decided that the sky was going to matter. My country had decided that a handful of us would be enough to catch up with Europe. I joined Mitsubishi that same year. I was 24 years old. They gave me an experimental carrier fighter called the 1MF-10. It flew. It flew badly. The landing gear was weak. The controls were heavy. The airplane never left the prototype stage. I did not consider this a failure. A failure is when you learn nothing. In 1929, the company sent me abroad, first to England, then to Germany. The Junkers works at Dessau, where all-metal aircraft were being assembled by men who had been doing it for a decade. Then to America, the Curtiss factory at Buffalo, New York. I stood inside a single building large enough to hold the entire aviation industry of Japan. I did not speak of what I saw. I took notes. I came home in 1930. I told my colleagues what alloys the Germans were rolling and how the Americans stamped their wing ribs. I did not tell them. I had seen the future, and the future was 30 years ahead of us. By 1932, I was chief designer at Mitsubishi Nagoya. I was 29 years old. That same year, I married a woman named Sumako Sasaki. She would give me 5 children. She would never once ask me what I was designing. 3 years later, I built the A5M, Japan's first low-wing all-metal monoplane fighter. Over China, it outflew every enemy the sky could show it. I was 32, and I was the most respected aircraft designer in Japan. I did not yet understand what that would cost. In October of 1937, an envelope arrived at my office from the Imperial Japanese Navy. I opened it. I read it. I read it again. The specification was called 12 Shi. 12 for the 12th year of the Showa era. The Navy wanted a carrier fighter. They wanted it to fly 500 kilometers per hour. They wanted it to climb 3,000 meters in 3.5 minutes. They wanted it to fly 3,000 kilometers with a drop tank. They wanted it to carry 2 20mm cannon, 2 machine guns, a radio, and a direction finder for navigation across open ocean. And they wanted this carrier fighter to be more maneuverable than the A5M, the most agile carrier aircraft in the world. I put the envelope on my desk. I stared at it for a long time. Then I did the calculations. The airplane the Navy was asking for could not exist. Not because we could not build any single part of it, because the parts contradicted each other. More range meant more fuel, which meant more weight. More weight meant a more powerful engine, and our engines were already 20% weaker than what Curtiss was building in Buffalo. A more powerful engine meant more weight. The circle closed on itself. Nakajima Aircraft received the same envelope on the same day. For 3 months, Nakajima's engineers ran the same calculations I was running. In January of 1938, they wrote a formal reply to the Imperial Navy. The specification, they said, was physically impossible. Nakajima withdrew, and I was now the only man in Japan the Navy could still ask. My superiors at Mitsubishi came to me. They had bomber contracts. They had production quotas. They did not want to gamble the company on an airplane that Nakajima had just called impossible. They told me to refuse it. I told them I could build it. I do not remember exactly what I said in that meeting. I remember that my voice was quiet. I remember that no one interrupted me. I remember that when I walked out of that room, the bomber project had been shelved, and the 12 Shi contract was mine. I went home that night to a small house in Nagoya. Sumako had kept dinner warm. My oldest child was already asleep. She poured tea and set a bowl in front of me. She did not ask what I had brought home from the office. I sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning. I drew the same wing 3 different ways. I threw all 3 away. For the next 18 months, I would come home long after Sumako had gone to bed. My children would grow used to a father who was a coat on a hook and a briefcase by the door. I would leave for the factory before the sun. I would return long after the sun had left the sky. And somewhere inside those 18 months, in a drafting room in Nagoya that smelled of cigarettes and cold tea, I made the decision I told you about at the beginning of this film. I took my red pencil. I crossed out 2 lines, and a Navy specification that the best engineers in Japan had called impossible became an airplane that would rule the Pacific Ocean for 18 months and destroy my country for the rest of its life. The problem was weight. Not one problem. Every problem. Every kilogram of fuel I added for range demanded a stronger wing to carry it, and a stronger wing weighed more, which demanded a stronger fuselage to hold the wing, which weighed more, which demanded a more powerful engine to lift it, and our engines could not be made more powerful. The circle tightened around my throat every night I sat at that drafting table. There was only one way out: take weight from somewhere else. I began with the airframe. I chose an aluminum alloy that had never been used in a production aircraft anywhere in the world. Extra Super Duralumin, developed by the Sumitomo Metal Company 2 years earlier. It was stronger than any aluminum American engineers had access to. It was also brittle. It would crack under stress that ordinary aluminum would only bend. I used it anyway. I designed the wing as a single continuous spar, with the fuel tanks built directly into the wing structure itself. The tanks were not separate components bolted in. They were part of the wing. I built the fuselage in 2 pieces joined by a ring of 80 bolts. Engine, cockpit, and wing became one rigid unit. The tail became another. No wasted metal at the junctions, no redundant framing. I saved kilograms this way. Not enough. I stripped out the radio mounting bracket and redesigned it in half the material. I thinned the cockpit floor. I shaved the ribs inside the wing until they looked like the bones of a bird. I saved grams. Grams became hundreds of grams. Hundreds of grams became kilograms. Not enough. There were 2 things left on the airplane that weighed real weight: the steel plate behind the pilot's seat and the rubber lining inside the fuel tanks. The Americans called it self-sealing. When a bullet punctured the tank, the rubber lining collapsed inward around the hole and stopped the fuel from pouring out. It did not always work. When it did, the pilot flew home. When it didn't, the pilot burned. The steel plate was simpler, a single sheet of hardened steel bolted behind the pilot's back. A rifle caliber round entering the cockpit from behind would strike the plate and stop. The pilot would survive. Without the plate, the round would pass through his spine before he heard the aircraft that fired it. Together, these 2 components weighed roughly 60 kilograms. 60 kilograms was the difference between an airplane that could meet the 12-she specification and an airplane that could not. I sat with that number for a long time. I told myself that a fighter that cannot be hit does not need armor. I told myself that Japanese pilots were the best in the world. I told myself that the airplane's speed and maneuverability would be its armor. These were true. These were also lies. I crossed out the steel plate. I crossed out the self-sealing tanks. I did not tell Sumako. I did not tell anyone. I finished the drawings. The empty weight of the airplane, when the last rivet was calculated, came to 1,680 kilograms, 3,704 pounds. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the fighter the United States Navy was preparing to fly against us from the decks of its carriers, had an empty weight of 2,612 kilograms, 5,758 pounds, nearly a full ton heavier than what I was drawing. The difference was not aluminum. The difference was the 60 kilograms of protection I had removed from the pilot who would sit inside it. On the 1st of April, 1939, the first prototype rolled out of the assembly hangar at Kagamigahara Airfield near Nagoya. The engine was a Mitsubishi A6M 780 horsepower. Not enough. I already knew we would replace it. The test pilot climbed into the cockpit. The propeller turned. The engine caught. I stood on the grass beside the runway. I did not move. The airplane accelerated. It lifted from the ground the way a hawk lifts from a fence post. It climbed. It banked. It came back around and passed over our heads at an altitude where I could see the pilot's face. He was smiling. When he landed, he did not shut down the engine immediately. He sat in the cockpit for almost a minute with the propeller still turning. When he finally climbed out, he walked directly to me. He said one sentence. "It flies exactly the way you said it would." I bowed. I did not answer. We spent the next year refining it. We replaced the WWII with a Nakajima Sakai 12, 940 horsepower. The performance opened up like a curtain pulling back. Top speed, 533 kilometers per hour at 4,550 meters. Climb to 3,000 meters, 3 minutes and 30 seconds, meeting the Navy's requirement to the second. Range with the drop tank, over 2,600 kilometers. No carrier fighter on Earth had those numbers. Not the American Wildcat, not the British Sea Hurricane, not anything the Germans or the Italians or the Soviets had ever flown. The Imperial Navy accepted the airplane for service in July of 1940. The Japanese calendar counted the year as 2,600 from the founding of the empire by Emperor Jimmu. The last 2 digits gave the fighter its official designation. Navy Type 0 Carrier Fighter. The pilots called it Ryzen. The world would come to call it the Zero. That night, Sumako set a cup of sake in front of me instead of tea. She had never done this before. She looked at me for a long moment. She asked if I was tired. I nodded. She did not ask what I had built. She refilled the cup. 6 weeks later, the airplane went to war. 13 Zeros were shipped to the 12th Kokutai, Japan's naval air group, operating from Hankow in central China. On the 13th of September 1940, they escorted a bomber formation to Chongqing, the wartime capital of the Republic of China. 27 Chinese fighters climbed to meet them. Polikarpov I-15 biplanes, Polikarpov I-16 monoplanes, Soviet-built, Soviet-supplied, flown by Chinese pilots who had been fighting the Japanese army for 3 years. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. All 27 Chinese fighters were destroyed. Not one Zero was lost. The report reached Tokyo within days. It reached Washington within weeks. Washington did not believe it. American military intelligence read the report and set it aside. The numbers, they said, were impossible. No Japanese aircraft could achieve a 27-0 kill ratio against modern Soviet fighters. The report must be propaganda. The report must be exaggeration. Japanese industry was not capable of building a first-rate combat aircraft, and Japanese pilots were widely believed in American military circles to have inferior eyesight, inferior reflexes, and inferior training. None of this was based on evidence. All of it was based on contempt. An American colonel named Claire Chennault, serving as an air combat advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, sent detailed intelligence reports directly to Washington about the Zero. He described its speed. He described its climb rate. He described the pattern of the 27-kill engagement. He warned that the United States would face this fighter in the Pacific and that no American combat aircraft in service could match it. His reports were filed. They were not acted upon. The Zero flew unchallenged over China for the next 15 months. Chinese pilots who survived encounters with it stopped taking off when Zeros were reported in the area. Chinese fighters were withdrawn from forward bases. The sky over eastern China became Japanese airspace by default, and in Washington, in London, in Manila, in Singapore, in Pearl Harbor, no one changed a single doctrine, no one modified a single tactic, and no one built a single new airplane in response to what was happening. Just before 8 in the morning, Hawaii time, on the 7th of December 1941, roughly 78, Zeros crossed the beach at Oahu. They came from 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku. They came to escort the bombers. They stayed to strafe the airfields. The American fighters that managed to get airborne, mostly P-40 Warhawks and P-36 Hawks, were shot out of the sky before they could form up. The airfields at Wheeler and Hickam burned for the rest of the day. On the same morning, other Zeros were destroying the United States Army Air Forces in the Philippines, catching most of General Douglas MacArthur's bombers on the ground. Other Zeros were burning Brewster Buffaloes over Malaya. Other Zeros were sweeping Hawker Hurricanes out of the sky over Singapore. For the next 6 months, the airplane I had built ruled the largest ocean on Earth. Historians would later estimate the kill ratio in the first half year of the Pacific War at approximately 12-1. 12 Allied aircraft destroyed for every Zero lost. Over the Dutch East Indies, Zeros accounted for the destruction of roughly 550 Allied aircraft during the campaign. In April of 1942, over Ceylon, Zeros acted the same 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor into the Indian Ocean itself and destroyed most of the British air defense of the island for the loss of a handful of their own. Saburo Sakai, who would end the war as Japan's leading surviving ace with 64 confirmed victories, wrote later that flying the Zero was like flying an extension of his own body. He said the boundary between pilot and airplane dissolved in combat. He said he had never flown anything before or after that felt so precisely alive in his hands. I read his memoir many years later. I did not disagree with any word of it. But there was something Sakai did not know when he wrote those sentences. And there was something I could not tell him. On the 7th of December, 1941, while my airplane was destroying the American Pacific Fleet on the other side of the ocean, I was lying in a hospital bed in Nagoya. Pleurisy. My lungs had filled with fluid. I had been coughing blood for 2 weeks. The doctors did not tell me whether I would recover. I heard the announcement of the Pearl Harbor attack on the hospital radio. The nurses in the corridor were crying with joy. The other patients were shouting. Someone was playing a military march on the loudspeaker in the courtyard below my window. I lay in my bed. I did not move. I closed my eyes. I already knew, in that hospital bed, in that first hour of that first war, that Japan had just committed suicide. I did not write this in any letter. I did not tell it to any doctor. I did not tell Sumiko when she came to see me that evening. But I wrote it in my private diary. And 30 years later, when I finally published my memoir under the title of Eagles of Mitsubishi, I let the world read what I had thought that morning. I had written that we in the aircraft industry had convinced ourselves right up to the last moment that our government would find a diplomatic solution before the situation became irreversible. I had written that instead, bereft of any strong move to seek a way out, Japan was being driven to doom. The man who had built the airplane that celebrated Pearl Harbor knew, in the hour of that celebration, that Pearl Harbor was the first minute of an ending that could not be stopped. I lay in the hospital for another 6 weeks. By the time I returned to the drafting room in Nagoya, the Zero had swept the Pacific from the coast of California to the coast of India, and in Alaska, in a place none of my engineers had ever heard of. The mistake that would give away every secret I had ever kept was already 6 months from happening. On the 4th of June, 1942, a 19-year-old flight petty officer, first class, named Tadayoshi Koga, lifted off the deck of the aircraft carrier Ryujo in the North Pacific. His airplane was an A6M Model 21, serial number 4593, red tail marking DI-108, yellow fuselage band identifying it as belonging to the second carrier division. His mission was to attack the American naval base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island in the Aleutians. He attacked. He and his two wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikada, shot down an American PBY-5A Catalina flying boat piloted by a lieutenant named Bud Mitchell. They strafed the crew as they swam in the freezing water. Mitchell died. His 6 crewmen died. During the strafing run, small arms fire from somewhere below severed the return oil line on Koga's Zero. His engine began to bleed itself dry. He turned east toward Akutan Island, which had been designated as an emergency landing site. A Japanese submarine was waiting offshore to recover any pilot who went down. Koga saw a flat green field a half-mile inland. He circled once. He lowered his landing gear. His wingman saw the glint of moisture on the grass, a heartbeat before the wheels touched. The field was not a field. It was a marsh. The wheels caught. The airplane flipped forward onto its back. The canopy struck the muskeg with the full weight of the aircraft on top of it. Koga died instantly. He was 19 years old. 5 weeks later, on the 10th of July, an American Navy PBY on routine patrol passed over Akutan Island. The pilot, Lieutenant William Thies, saw sunlight reflecting off metal in the marsh below. He circled. He marked the position. He returned to Dutch Harbor with news that would change the Pacific War. The Zero was almost intact. American recovery teams tried 3 times. The first 2 failed. On the 15th of July, a third team with proper heavy equipment freed the airplane from the mud, hauled it overland to a barge, and shipped it south. By the 1st of August, my airplane was in San Diego. The engineers at the Grumman Aircraft Corporation on Long Island received the complete performance data within weeks. Every dimension, every alloy, every gram of what I had built, and every gram of what I had not built. They read the report the way a surgeon reads a diagnosis. They found what I had removed. No armor behind the pilot's seat. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Roll rate collapsing above 320 kilometers per hour because the ailerons became too heavy for a human arm to move. Structural failure in high-speed dives above 660 kilometers per hour because the extra super duralumin I had chosen for its strength was too brittle to absorb the loads. Every secret I had crossed out with my red pencil in Nagoya in the winter of 1938 was now written down in English in an American laboratory, and Grumman was already drawing an airplane specifically designed to exploit every one of them. They called it the F-6F Hellcat. 2,000 horsepower, more than double the engine my country could build. Steel armor behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing rubber lining every fuel tank, wings strong enough to dive without folding, ailerons redesigned to remain light at high speeds. It was in every measurable sense the exact opposite of the airplane I had built. It was, in the most literal sense possible, the answer to a question I had asked in a Nagoya drafting room 4 years earlier and forgotten to consider. Question had been, what if we lose the initiative? The Hellcat entered squadron service in the middle of 1943. By the end of that year, my airplane was no longer the best fighter in the Pacific. By the middle of 1944, it was not even the second best. I understood. Watching the reports come in through the winter of 43 and the spring of 44, what was happening to the pilots who flew what I had made. Their airplane was slower now. Their airplane could not dive. Their airplane could not run. And when American rounds finally found the cockpit, there was nothing behind the pilot's seat to stop them, and there was nothing inside the fuel tank to close the hole. I had traded their protection for 18 months of superiority. Those 18 months were over, and there were still 3 years of war to fight. I began work on a successor, the J-2M Raiden, a land-based interceptor built for climb rate and firepower rather than maneuverability. It was plagued by engine problems from the first prototype. It never reached production in meaningful numbers. I began work on another, the A7M Repu, intended to replace the Zero on the carriers of the combined fleet. It never entered production at all before the war ended. My country's industrial base was being burned to the ground. American B-29 superfortresses were bombing Nagoya. The factories where I had built the Zero were being systematically destroyed by an airplane I had no answer for. American submarines were sinking the tankers that carried oil to our engines. There was no aluminum, there was no rubber, there was almost no fuel. And on the 19th and 20th of June, 1944, in the Philippine Sea, roughly 550 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single two-day battle. The American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The pilots we sent up in those Zeros were 19 and 20 years old. They had weeks of training where their predecessors had had years. They flew an airplane that had been the best in the world when their older brothers first climbed into it. And they flew it against an American fighter designed specifically to slaughter them. Almost none of them came home. The men who had ruled the sky over Pearl Harbor and Ceylon and the Dutch East Indies were dead. Killed at Midway, killed at Guadalcanal, killed in the endless grinding air war over Rabaul and the Solomon Islands. The airplane had outlived the pilots who had known how to fly it. And then, in October of 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Navy did something that I had not imagined was possible. They loaded a 250-kilogram bomb onto a Zero. They gave the airplane to a boy who had been in flight school 6 months earlier. They told him not to come back. The airplane I had designed to fly 3,000 kilometers and return to its carrier was now being flown by children who were given exactly enough fuel to reach an American ship. My airplane became a guided missile with a heartbeat inside it. More Zeros were used in kamikaze attacks than any other type of aircraft in the Japanese arsenal during the last year of the war. I sat in my office in Nagoya and read the reports. The airplane I had built to save my pilots by outperforming their enemies was now killing my pilots on purpose. I did not write about this in any letter. I did not tell Sumako. I did not tell my colleagues, but I wrote it in the same private diary I had opened on the morning of Pearl Harbor. By the summer of 1945, my factories were rubble. Tokyo was rubble. Osaka was rubble. Nagoya was rubble. 10,939 Zeros had been built in the 6 years since I had watched the first prototype lift off the runway at Kagamegahara, more than any other Japanese airplane of the war. On the 6th of August, 1945, the city of Hiroshima ceased to exist. On the 9th of August, Nagasaki followed. On the 15th of August, the Emperor of Japan spoke over the radio for the first time in the history of the imperial line. I listened to the announcement from a small room in what was left of Nagoya. I did not weep. I did not speak. I sat with my hands folded on my knees, and I understood, at last and completely, what I had spent 7 years building. In the autumn of 1946, a directive arrived at what remained of the Mitsubishi headquarters. American occupation authorities had studied the structure of the Japanese wartime economy, and they had reached a conclusion. The Zaibatsu, the great industrial dynasties that had built the ships, the rifles, the tanks, and the airplanes of the empire, could not be allowed to survive intact. Mitsubishi was first on the list. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the largest private company in the history of Japan, was ordered dissolved. By decree of the occupation, the company was broken into 3 separate entities: West Japan Heavy Industries, Central Japan Heavy Industries, East Japan Heavy Industries. Each was forbidden to coordinate with the others. Each was forbidden to use the name Mitsubishi. The three-diamond logo that Yataro Iwasaki had chosen in 1870 was ordered removed from every letterhead, every factory sign, every rail car in the country. The manufacture of aircraft was prohibited entirely. The Nagoya Works, the walled compound where I had drawn the Zero, where the Zero had been assembled by thousands of men and women, where the Zero had rolled off a production line that ran without stopping for 6 years, was ordered converted to civilian manufacture. The engineers who had calculated the wing loads of a carrier fighter that could cross the Pacific were now told to design something else. The company chose a motor scooter. They called it the Silver Pigeon. It was a small two-wheeled machine with a single-cylinder engine and a top speed a healthy man could exceed on a bicycle if the road ran downhill. It was cheap, it was reliable. It carried a rice merchant's daughter to school in the morning and a farmer's produce to market in the afternoon. It rolled off the same assembly line that had built the Zero. The men who had riveted the wing spars of a fighter that shot down 27 aircraft in 10 minutes over Chungking were now bolting handlebars onto scooter frames. I did not laugh when I saw the first Silver Pigeon leave the Nagoya Works. I did not weep either. I understood something that was harder than laughter and harder than tears. The discipline had survived. The obsession with weight, the refusal to accept a single unnecessary gram, the hunt for the last bolt that could be redesigned in half the material, this had not been about the Zero. This had been about the men who built the Zero, and the men had not been dissolved by American decree. They had walked home from the ruins of Nagoya, and they had come back to work in the morning, and they were now applying the same relentless subtraction to the frame of a 50 cubic centimeter motor scooter. The airplane was gone. The habit was not. I was not permitted to design aircraft during those years. No one in Japan was. The prohibition was absolute, and it lasted until the occupation ended in 1952. I spent those years in a small house in Tokyo. Sumako had followed me from Nagoya. Our 5 children were growing. None of them ever asked me what I had done during the war. I do not know whether that was a mercy or a wound. I never asked which of the two they intended. I read a great deal. I taught a small evening class in aerodynamics at a private engineering school. I did not speak in public about the Zero. I did not accept requests for interviews. When old colleagues from Mitsubishi came to visit, we drank tea and we talked about their children. We did not talk about the airplanes. In 1952, the occupation ended. The ban on the Mitsubishi name was lifted. The 3 successor companies began the slow work of reintegration, though it would take another 12 years before they were formally reunited. In 1956, I joined a consortium organized by the Japanese government to design the first commercial passenger aircraft built in Japan since the war. It was called the NAMC YS-11, a twin-engine turboprop, a modest airplane by the standards of the American and European jets that were beginning to dominate the world's airways. More than 180 were built. They flew for airlines across Asia and South America and Africa. A small number flew for domestic carriers inside the United States. The airplane was not remarkable in any of the ways the Zero had been remarkable. It carried no cannon. It broke no records. It killed no one. I was very proud of it. In 1960, I was still working on the YS-11. Another division of the reconstituted Mitsubishi released its first passenger car. It was called the Mitsubishi 500, a rear-engine sedan with a 493 cubic centimeter two-cylinder engine, producing 21 horsepower. The empty weight of the car was 490 kilograms. I read the specification sheet. 490 kilograms was almost exactly the weight I had removed from the F4F Wildcat when I designed the Zero. The engineers at Mitsubishi had not intended the parallel. Most of them had never met me. Some of them had not been born when I built the airplane, but they were the professional descendants of the men I had worked with in Nagoya in the winter of 1938, and they had asked the same question I had asked. They had asked it about a car instead of an airplane. Where can we remove weight? On the 22nd of April, 1970, the automobile division of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was formally separated into an independent company, Mitsubishi Motors. The company built pickup trucks and small sedans through the 1970s. It built a rugged four-wheel drive utility vehicle called the Pajero that dominated the Dakar Rally through the 1980s and 90s. It built a compact rally car called the Lancer Evolution that became one of the most successful competition vehicles in the history of motorsport. The engineering culture that had produced the Zero was now producing vehicles that could cross the Sahara and climb the Andes and endure punishment that would destroy their competitors. The habit had transferred. The obsession had found a new object. In 1970, at the age of 67, I published my memoir of the Zero. I wrote it in a small study at the back of my house in Tokyo. It took me 2 years. I had kept detailed notebooks throughout the war, and I had preserved my private diary, and I had also preserved the letters I had written to Sumako from the hospital in 1941 when I had been too sick to work and too honest to lie. I did not soften what I had thought during the war. I did not soften what I had done. The book was translated into English in 1981, 1 year before I died. It was published by the University of Washington Press under the title Eagles of Mitsubishi, the story of the Zero fighter. American aviation historians read it carefully. They found in it the confession of a man who had believed his country was being pushed toward its own destruction from the first hour of the war, and who had built the war's most devastating carrier fighter anyway. They found in it a technical account of the decisions I had made in that Nagoya drafting room, and they found in it the moral weight of those decisions, which I had never spoken aloud in the 40 years between the making of the Zero and the writing of the book. In the Autumn Honors List of 1973, the government of Japan awarded me the Order of the Rising Sun, 3rd class. I accepted it in a small ceremony. I did not make a speech. On the 11th of January 1982, I died of pneumonia in a Tokyo hospital. I was 78 years old. Sumako had passed some years before. I was survived by 5 children, none of whom had become engineers. My obituary appeared on the front page of Washington and the New York Times in an America that had once dismissed the reports of my airplane over Chungking King as propaganda, and that had lost a great many young men to the airplane it had refused to take seriously. 31 years after my death, in the summer of 2013, a Japanese filmmaker named Hayao Miyazaki released an animated motion picture about my life. He called it The Wind Reeses. Miyazaki was not a stranger to what I had built. His father, Katsuji Miyazaki, had been the director of Miyazaki Airplane, a family firm that had manufactured rudder assemblies for the Zero during the war. The Miyazaki family had grown wealthy on subcontracts from Mitsubishi. Hayao had spent his childhood surrounded by the residue of that wealth and the silence that surrounded it. He had waited 40 years to tell my story because his own family history was tangled with it. He had waited until he was 72 years old to release the film. The film was controversial in Japan. Some Japanese critics accused Miyazaki of glorifying a wartime weapons designer. Others accused him of the opposite, of turning a national hero into an ambivalent, guilt-ridden dreamer. Neither accusation was entirely wrong. Both missed what he was actually doing. He was, at the end of a long life, telling a story a son could only tell about a father when the father had been dead for many years. He was telling the story of an engineer who had loved his work and had hated the war that his work had served. He understood me because he had grown up inside the same contradiction. The Zero was not the best fighter of the Second World War. By 1943, it was not the best fighter in the Pacific. By 1944, it was being flown by children into the sides of American ships because it could no longer defeat American fighters in the air. The airplane I built was defeated by a better airplane, flown by better trained pilots, produced by a country that could out-manufacture Japan by a factor of 10. None of this diminishes what the airplane was in 1941. A carrier fighter with the range of a medium bomber, the maneuverability of an aerobatic aircraft, 6-hour endurance, cannon armament, powered by an engine 20% weaker than anything its opponents flew. That airplane should not have existed. The specification that produced it had been declared physically impossible by the second largest aircraft manufacturer in Japan. I built it anyway. I built it by asking one question of every rivet, every rib, every centimeter of every spar in the airframe. Where can I remove weight? I asked the question until the airplane weighed less than any of my opponents believed was achievable. I asked the question until I had removed the armor behind the pilot's seat and the rubber lining from the fuel tanks. And when the war ended, and the airplane ended, and the empire that had commissioned it ended, the same question was asked of a scooter, and then of a small car, and then of a rally sedan that would cross the Sahara Desert without braking, and finally, in the workshops of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in the 21st century, of a rocket that carries Japanese satellites to orbit from the same city, where I once drew a fighter that ruled an ocean. The rocket is called the H-3. It launches from Tanegashima. It is designed and built by the direct professional descendants of the men who worked with me in Nagoya in the winter of 1938. The company that produces it is Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, employing more than 77,000 people and generating annual revenues that exceed 4.5 trillion. The 3 diamonds that Yataro Iwasaki chose in 1870 still appear on the fairings of that rocket. The habit did not die when the airplane died. It did not die when the empire that had commissioned the airplane died. It did not die when I died. The habit is what Japan built after the war ended. The habit is what allowed a nation whose cities were ash to become, within a single generation, the second largest economy on Earth. The habit is what put a Japanese-built satellite into geostationary orbit and a Japanese-built sedan into the driveway of a suburban house in Ohio. The habit began in a drafting room in Nagoya on a winter night in 1938 when a small, quiet man with a red pencil asked one question of a single blueprint. The question ruined him. The question ruined a great many young men who never learned his name. The question also, in ways he could not have foreseen and would have been ashamed to celebrate, saved his country. I did not think of myself as a great man. I did not think of myself as a war criminal, though there were men in Tokyo after the war who would have argued that I should have been tried as one. I thought of myself as an engineer. I built the best airplane I knew how to build with the materials that my country could give me. I was told what to build, and I built it, and I understood the price, and I paid it, and I let others pay it, and I lived to see what came after. That is all. That is the entire story. An engineer and a country, and one question repeated for 80 years. Where can we remove weight?
As they were just capable of carrying a 500-pound bomb, and their maneuverability allowed them to penetrate American and British carrier defenses. Being relegated to the role of suicide bomber, which only mildly slowed the Allied advance to Japan, would be the final anticlimactic chapter for the once dominant Zero. I'm Johnny, thanks for watching this series.